In this video, we're going to be building this procedural alien egg shader material in Blender. This material is super customizable and is something that I designed to be able to produce a bunch of different looks like alien egg sacs, organic growths, and other biologically inspired abstract materials. I have two versions of this tutorial. This is going to be a longer, slower version where I build this material in real time and explain why I'm doing things the way that I'm doing as I go. If you want something faster paced, I have a fast lightning version of this tutorial. In that tutorial, I quickly run down all of the steps in 10 minutes. I'll put a link to that video up in the corner and also in the description. You can also get the .blend file for this material for free on our Blender Market page. Just choose the free version of our procedural organic materials product. The link for that is in the description. In terms of skill level, this tutorial is going to be targeted towards intermediate level users who already have some experience with shader nodes, and I'm going to be using Blender 4.0 for this tutorial. Okay, so we're going to get started with a completely new Blender scene with the default cube. We're actually going to leave the default cube here, and then the first thing that we're going to do is to set up our rendering. So for this, we're going to need to use the Cycles render engine. So I'm going to change the render engine over here from Eevee to Cycles. And since I have a GPU, I'm going to change the device from CPU to GPU compute. And then the next thing that we're going to do is to just set up the lighting. So I'm going to change this to the rendered view, and I'm going to drag up another window and set this as the shader editor, and go over to the world shader editor, and we're just going to add in an HDRI image texture. So I'm going to hit Shift A, select an environment texture, connect that up, and then we're going to need to load in an environment texture file. So I'm going to hit open, and then I'm just going to navigate to the HDRI that I already have saved. Okay, so this is just a studio HDRI from HDRI Haven. I'm just gonna pull this up right here. From Polyhaven. So this is just a free HDRI that I'm using. It isn't absolutely necessary, but just to have the lighting consistent, if you wanna get that, then you can get that for free. So, and then the final thing that I'm gonna do for setting up the rendering is I actually don't like that the HDRI is visible. So I'm going to come over here to the render properties tab and scroll down to film, hit that, and then I'm going to change the film to transparent. And the reason for that is just that I just want the lighting information from the HDRI. I don't want the image in the background because it isn't really consistent with the look that we're trying to get. And then the next thing that we're going to do is actually turn this cube into a sphere that we can use to preview the material. So I'm going to select the cube. I'm going to go over to the modifiers tab. I'm going to add a subdivision surface modifier. I'm going to set this up to a high number, so 6. And I'm actually going to apply that modifier. And then the next thing I'm going to do is, just because this isn't quite spherical, I'm going to add a cast modifier, and you can see the shape is set to sphere. We're going to set this to 1, and then I'm going to apply that modifier, and that's just going to make it a little more spherical. And the reason that we're using a cube rather than a UV sphere is just that the topology of the mesh is going to be better than the UV sphere because it doesn't have those poles at the top and the bottom. Okay. And then the final thing that I'm going to do for setting up this sphere is I'm actually going to add another subdivision surface modifier. And the reason for that is I just want to have an additional layer of control that I can change while we're setting up these materials to add in additional detail if I feel like we need it. Okay, and then there's just one final thing that I want to do before we actually get started with making this material, which is enabling the Node Wrangler add-on. And that's going to make things just easier for actually setting up everything with the nodes in the material. So I'm going to go over to Edit, Preferences, Add-ons, and then here you can search for Node Wrangler. And then you just want to make sure that's enabled. So you don't need to install it. It is already installed with Blender. You just need to make sure to check that box and enable it. Alright, so now we have everything set up to actually start building this material. So the first thing that I want to do is actually look at the final version of this material and start to break down what we're going to go through and build. So I'm going to pull up actually a final built version of this material here. And when I'm going through the process of building this materials, I try to break this down into big, medium, and small shapes, and then build up systematically through those hierarchies of shapes and colors. So if we look at this, we can see that at the largest scale, at the most coarse scale, we have these sort of bulging egg-like structures that are scattered all around the mesh. And the first thing that I think about whenever I see these types of scattered objects that have clearly defined centers with some sort of disorder to them is what's known as a Voronoi texture. So we're going to go back to our scene and we're going to start building this up. First, trying to target building up those big shapes. So I'm going to switch over to the object shader type, and we already have a principled BSDF shader material defined here. I'm just going to call this alien eggs. And so the first thing that we want to do is start building up this Voronoi. So I'm going to add in a Voronoi texture node. So Shift A to add, search Voronoi texture. And then we're going to have a bunch of different options. And right now I'm just going to keep this as Euclidean. So a useful shortcut that we're going to be using a lot in this tutorial is selecting a node and hitting Control, Shift, left click. And that's basically going to allow us to preview the output of that node just as a color. So we can already see that this has some of those features that we wanted. It has these well-defined centers that are dark spots that go out to these edges and this sort of cell-like pattern. But we can already see that this is sort of the reverse of what we want. So we want this to actually be eventually a height map for the material, and we want the centers to be bulging out. So actually what we're going to do is add in a color ramp, and then we're just going to use this drop down menu here and go to flip color ramp. And then now we see that we have this lighter region in the center, and then it goes out to these darker regions at the edges. So we're going to start using this now to actually build up this material. So I'm going to make the color into the principled BSDF color and plug in that BSDF to the surface. And then the next thing that I'm going to do is actually also make this texture drive the displacement of the material. So I'm going to Shift A, search for displacement. And I'm going to plug this color info into the height here of the displacement, and then plug the displacement into the material output. Okay, so now we can see that we've got this displacement look on our material, but there's already a problem, which is that actually this looks pretty flat. We can see that there isn't actually real displacement if we look at it from different angles. So what we're going to do is come over here to the material tab. We're going to set the material properties, and we're going to come down to settings, and we can see the displacement is set to bump only. So that means it's just using this fake bump displacement. So what we're going to do instead is set this to displacement and bump, which is actually going to use real displacement on the material for larger length scales where the subdivision scale of the mesh will allow. And then it's going to use fake bump for the really small length scale details where there isn't enough geometry on the mesh to allow that. So we can see that now this is actually producing pretty extreme displacement. So the next thing that I'm actually going to do is I want to tone this down a little bit. And the simplest way that we can do that is to just add in I'm going to add in a math node here, and I'm going to set this to multiply, and then I'm going to set the value to be a smaller number that it's going to allow us to adjust the magnitude of that displacement. So I think this is okay for now. So we're gonna set that to 0.1. Okay, so there's already something that I don't like about the way that this looks, and that's that there is a very high degree of sharpness to this peak. So it doesn't look round the way that the final material that we're targeting looks. So one thing that I really like to use for this purpose is the float curve node. So I'm going to add that Shift A float curve. And then this is actually going to allow us to really sculpt the shape that we want. So the shape that we want here is we want something that is really rounded at the top rather than coming to this sharp peak. And then actually the shape of this curve is going to, in many ways, just give us the shape that we want in the actual geometry. So you can see as we pull this up, it is sort of flattening out the top, and then I just want to make it a little bit sharper at the bottom. So I'm going to click here and add another node and pull that down. And then now we can see that we really rounded out that shape a lot so it doesn't have those sharp peaks. And right now it's only going into the displacement, so I'm going to also plug that into the color node. And then we're already starting to get this geometric feature that we were seeing, that we're targeting for the final material. So right now it's repeating at a pretty high frequency. So one thing that we can do is come over here to the Voronoi texture. And as we adjust the scale parameter, if we go to higher scales, it's going to repeat more frequently. And if we go to lower scales, it's going to repeat less frequently. So maybe for now we can set this to be around 4. And then that's going to give us something where we can clearly see these shapes. And the next thing that I want to do is to actually provide an additional level of control over this shape. So eventually what we're going to want to do is, rather than having to mess around with this full node network, we're going to want to just have a set of simple input parameters that we can use to control the shape. So the next thing I'm going to do is set in this math power node. So we're going to add in a math node. I'm going to set this to power. So I'm going to set this to 1. Okay, so now that we've set down this power function, what I want to do is very briefly describe just some of the characteristics of this, because that's going to be really useful for helping to guide us to how we can actually use it to customize the material. So if we actually pull up a plot of this exponential function, here I have a few different curves that look at how the shape of this looks for different values of the exponent, so alpha. So here we're assuming that we have some input going from 0 to 1, which is what we're going to get from those noise functions. And then we're changing the value of that exponent and looking at how it's going to shape the output of that curve. So what you can see is that as you go to values above 1 in the exponent, this curve is going to become a lot sharper toward the peak. And as we go to values below 1, that curve is going to become a lot more rounded at the top. So what this means for us is that if we want to really round out this shape that we have here, what we can do is decrease the value of the exponent to below 1. And you can see it's sort of flattening it and rounding it out at the top. And then if we go to higher values, what we're going to find is that it's going to make everything a lot more sharp towards the peak, and we can make it actually really pretty sharp and really change the shape a lot just by tuning this value of the exponent. So that is something that I like to do for this, is use this float curve to establish the basic shape of the eggs, and then use this power function as something that we're going to use down the road as an input that we can use to further tune this just by changing this single parameter. But we're already getting to a point where we're actually starting to have a lot of different parameters that are getting tuned, and I'd like to organize this in a way that is going to make it just a lot simpler for us to actually control these and play around with the parameters. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these nodes except for the material output, and I'm going to hit Control G. And what that's going to do is actually create this node group. And actually right now we're inside the node group. So if I hit Tab, then now we're leaving that node group and going back into the top level, where we can see now it's just plugging the outputs, the BSDF, and the displacement into the material output. So if we select this node group and hit tab, then what we can see now is that we have basically created this container for this node network. And the reason that that's going to be useful for us is that now we can start to expose different parameters that we can use to more easily tune the material without having to dig into this node network down the road. So there are a few different things that we would probably like to be able to tune in this node network. One is we're going to need to use this vector for the texture. We're going to want to access the scale, which, as you recall, is going to change the repeat pattern of this. So I'm going to set that to 4. And for now, I think another thing that we'd like to be able to change is the randomness of this texture. So right now it's set to 1, but if we go down, we can see if we go down to 0, it becomes very regular. So you have this almost grid-like packing of these objects. And then if we go back up to 1, then it becomes, as you would expect, a lot more random. So I'm going to also plug that in as an input. And then the other thing that we would like to have access to is this power function, specifically the exponent. And so I'm going to plug that in. And then now you can see that just this name value right here isn't very informative. So what I'm going to do is over here in the side menu, which you can pull up by just hitting the N key, is I'm going to go to the group tab up here. I'm going to go down to value, and I'm going to actually rename that by double clicking it. So I'm going to call this egg shape fall off, and I'm going to call the randomness, well, actually I think that is fine. And then the scale I'm going to call egg scale. So now we have this set of group inputs. So if I hit tab again and go into the top level, then now you can see that we have this node group where we just have these parameters exposed for us that we can easily tune to get different effects without having to worry about the full node network. And that's going to make it a lot easier for us down the road when we actually want to use this material. So I'm going to click on this, hit tab again to enter it. So now we have the basic shape of these eggs. So that means now we can start moving into adding some additional levels of detail to this. Okay, so what I'm going to do is let's bring back up the shader that we're trying to create. So this is the final shader that we're trying to create. And now that we've created these egg bulging shapes, now what we'd like to do is add some of this color information. So what we can see is that we have, at the largest scale, these two main different colors. There's this color of the egg, and then there's the color of the grooves between those eggs. And we're going to ignore these vein-like structures for now, because we're going to build those in later on. So the nice thing is that we already have this mask that we've created that is driving the shape of the eggs that we can also use to define some of the color information. So what we're going to do is we're going to take actually the output of this, and we're going to use that to drive basically a mix color node. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit Shift A, I'm going to add a mix color node. And then what we're going to do is take the output of this shape and actually use that in the factor input. So basically, anytime this factor is 1 or white, it's going to take the bottom color B. And then when it is at low values, it's going to take the color A. So now we can create two different colors. And I'm going to set the color B, which is going to be our main color, to sort of an orangish color. And I'm going to set our color A to be similar to the final output that we were looking at before, this sort of dark green color. And then what we're going to do is just plug this color result into the base color of the principled BSDF. Okay, so now we're actually seeing two different colors that are being controlled by the shape of that output curve of the eggs. Okay, so this looks pretty bad right now, but there's a couple of quick things that I want to fix. One is that I'm noticing that there is this sort of grid-like texture on this, and the problem is that we haven't set this to shade smooth. So I'm going to click this object, right click, shade smooth, and that's going to smooth out the surface of that shape. And then the second thing that I'm going to do is, one of the issues right now is that this is a pretty rough surface and I want it to just look wetter. So I'm going to come over to the principled BSDF. I'm going to set the roughness down. So maybe let's set it to 0.2 to give it a little bit more wetness. And then the second thing that I'm going to do is use the clear coat, and that's going to add this appearance of sort of an additional layer of wetness on the material. And we can independently control the wetness of that. And the final thing that I'm going to do at this stage is I'm actually going to add in some subsurface scattering. So I'm going to set this to be a weight of 1, and that's just going to give it a little bit more of a natural appearance, similar to the subsurface scattering that we would see in skin and in other tissues. And then the next thing that I want to do is I want to have a little bit more independent control of the displacement of the egg and the color of these grooves. So just like we used before, what we're going to do is we're going to drop another math power node in, and then we're going to use that to shape the factors. So we're going to switch this to power mode. And then just like before, lower values are going to make this more rounded, and higher values are going to make it sharper towards the peak. So what we're going to do is, as we increase this exponent, we can see that the color is starting to shift and creep up more and more towards the top of those eggs. So this is going to basically play the role of a width of the groove color. So I'm actually going to add this as another input to the group input. So I'm going to plug this exponent in over here, and we're going to come over here and call this value the groove color width. Okay, so we still have ways to go, but I'm just going to fine tune a couple things real quick. So I'm going to change, we had this multiply here in the displacement. I'm just going to bump that up a little bit to 0.15 just to give it a little bit more displacement. And then I actually want to make this green color just a little bit darker for now. And so the next thing that we want to move on to, so let's pull up that final egg shape that we're targeting. And what we can see is maybe the next level of detail that we want to add to this is these vein-like structures that are covering the entire material. So let's get started to adding those. And before we get started with that, we're going to do just a little bit of node organization because things are going to get a little bit more complicated. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select all of these nodes right here that are controlling this egg shape, and I'm going to hit Control J, and that's going to join those into this frame. And if I select that frame, come over to the sidebar here, again, that you can toggle by hitting the N key. I can go to node, and then I'm going to label that egg shape. And under the properties here, I'm going to change the label size maybe to 60. So this is just going to help us as we start to build up this node network so that we can clearly identify what each part of the node network is doing. So now we can start building in these egg shapes, or sorry, the vein shapes. So what is going to be really useful for this is a Musgrave texture. So I'm going to hit Shift A and then Musgrave texture. And just, this is Blender 4.0. If you're using Blender 4.1, the Musgrave texture has actually been incorporated into the noise texture. So you can use that instead. And then we're gonna use Control-Shift-Click to visualize this real quick. So this right here really doesn't look like veins at all. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to this drop down menu where we can change what is the type of noise, and I'm going to change this to ridged multifractal. So already we can see that we're starting to get something that has more of the appearance of veins, in the sense that we can see what looks like sort of like lines that we could probably exaggerate a little bit further. So what I'm going to do is drop in a color ramp node, because we want the veins to be the white region, since that's going to be basically where the veins are. So again, I'm going to flip this color ramp, and then now we can see that it really isn't that visible. So we're going to need to exaggerate this effect a little bit more. So in order to exaggerate this effect, we could use the color ramp just by taking this black level and dragging it up. But I want to be able to actually access the numerical value. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop in a map range node. And then what this is going to do is whatever we set the from minimum to, that's going to define basically the new black point of this texture. So if we start to raise this, and we can see that the closer it gets to 1, the thinner and thinner those lines become until it goes above 1, and then it's not going to work anymore. So I'm going to set this to 0.995 for now, and then now we have something that really has more of the appearance of these sort of thin lines, and then we can change the scale over here to control the repeat pattern of those lines. And then a little bit later, we're going to add in the capability to really control the thickness of this in a more intuitive way. So the first thing that we want to do with these veins is we want to be able to use those to drive the displacement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust this. You can see over here is where we're taking the displacement from the eggs, and all we're going to do is add those heights together of the veins and the eggs, so that those are then going to add together into the final height map for the displacement. So I'm going to add in a math node for adding here. We're going to set this after this multiply node, because this is controlling the strength of the displacement of the egg specifically. And then we're going to plug in the result from this map range node, where we're setting up the vein texture, into this add node right here. And then right now we're previewing the texture map right now. So we're going to go back to the principled BSDF and use that. So right now we can see this displacement is way too large. So actually what we're going to do is add in another math node. We're going to set this to multiply. And then this is basically going to allow us to independently control the displacement of the veins and the egg. So I'm going to set this to a small value, maybe 0.05 or even lower, 0.02. So the veins just don't need nearly as much displacement as the eggs. So now we have these two different multiply nodes that we can use to independently control the strength of the displacement of the eggs and the veins. So now that we have a few different parameters that we have set up, I'm actually going to add in another group node. So we can hit Shift A, group input. So this is the same type of group input node that was originally set up with this material. You can actually, we could just use this one down here, but you can actually set up as many of these as you want. So I like to set them up close to different blocks of my node networks just to keep everything clean. So we have another scale, and actually we want the same vector input to be driving the Musgrave texture and the egg texture. The scale, now we want this to have a more descriptive value, so we're going to come back to this group tab here and call this vein scale. And then the next thing that we want to be able to control is probably the strength of the displacement of the vein. So I'm going to drag from this multiply node here where we were tuning that. And we can call this vein displacement. And then similarly, I also want to be able to access the egg shape displacement value in our node group. So I'm going to drag this value from the multiply node over to this group input. And I'm going to call this egg displacement. So now, right now we can see the veins are coming through in terms of the displacement on the material, but they're not coming through in terms of the color. So similar to how we made different colors for the egg peaks and the grooves, we also want to add another mixed color node in that's going to allow us to shift between the colors of the eggs and the veins. We're going to add a mixed color node, and I'm going to add this after the color of the eggs and the grooves, because we want the veins to be sort of on top of everything. And right now we have, from this output over here, a texture that is white when it's on the veins and black when it's not. And I'm actually going to use the output from the map range, not this multiply node, because the multiply node is being modulated by our displacement. So what we're going to do is drag from the map range node into this mix color node, and then since this is going white on the veins and black not, then we want the vein color to be down in this color in the B, in the bottom one. So I'm going to preview the principled BSDF again, and then now we can actually set the vein color to be anything that we want. So I'm going to set this to also be sort of a dark green color. Okay, and then two final things that we're going to do with the eggs. One is that we'd like to be able to control the opacity of the color. We have a tuning knob for the magnitude of the displacement, but I'm going to add a math node in between this map range node from the veins and into this mixed color node. And I'm going to set this to multiply. And then now we have something that if we change the value here between 0 and 1, then it's going to change the opacity of the color of those veins. So I'm going to set it to 1 right now. And then I'm going to drag this value into the group input. And I'm going to change the name of that to vein opacity. And then one last thing I want to do with the veins for right now is just give us an easier to use tuning knob for the thickness of the veins. So right now we're tuning this with this from min value, which is really sensitive. And if it goes above 1, then it doesn't work at all. So we can see between the range of 0.895 to 0.995, it changes a lot. So actually, the thickness of the veins is really 1 minus whatever this value is. So let me show you what I mean by that. So if we do a math node, and I'm going to set this to subtract, set the top value to 1, and I'm going to set this to, let's say, 0.1, and then plug that into the from min value. And then now what we can see is that if I set this to 0, then there is no thickness to the veins. If I set this to 1, they're really thick. 0.5, thinner. So this gives us a more intuitive control. So I'm going to set this to maybe 0.05. And then we can take that value here and basically plug that in here. And then we're going to call that just vein thickness. So now we have an independent tuning knob for the color of the veins, the strength of their displacement, their width, and also the opacity of the color. So we've come a long way with this, but if we pull back up the shader that we're targeting, we still really aren't there yet. So this still has a much more organic look. It looks a lot more natural. If we look at the shade that we have right here, it just looks kind of plasticky. So getting to that final level is really going to be about adding in those higher frequency details and building those in, and that's going to have a huge effect. So the next thing that we're going to do is, again, just going to organize these nodes. So I'm going to select these nodes that are controlling the veins, hit Control J, then go over to node here on the right. I'm going to label this veins, make the label size 80. So that way it'll be easy for us to figure out which part is doing what. So the next thing that we're going to do is try to add in some high frequency bumpy noise into this. So if we pull back up the texture that we're targeting, we can see that there's a lot of fine detail that is really breaking up this texture, that is giving it that additional level of realism and believability. So for this, I'm going to use just a simple noise texture. So Shift A, noise texture. And then we're going to preview this by hitting Control Shift Click. And what we're going to do is we want this to be really high frequency noise. So I'm going to increase this scale a lot and maybe set it to something like 50. And then the next thing that we're going to do is we want to, again, add this noise into the displacement that is being fed into the displacement of that material. So we're going to add another add node, and we can see right now the veins are being added on top of the eggs, and then we're going to add this noise texture on top of the output of that. So I'm going to add this and this, and then right now we're previewing the noise texture, so I'm going to preview the BSDF again. And then again, we're having the same problem that we were having before with the veins. This is just way too strong. So I'm going to add in a math node, and I'm going to change this to multiply. And basically we want to multiply the output of this to some smaller value just to decrease the magnitude of it. So let's set this to maybe 0.05 for now. And even that looks like it might be a little too strong, so I'm going to actually set it to 0.025. Okay, so now we can see that this is, even just doing that has actually added a lot to this material. It just has a lot more realism. And I'm actually going to decrease the thickness of the veins a little bit. So the way that I'm going to do that is actually in the side panel here, we can see that actually we have all these input values that we've been creating. So I'm going to set this to 0.025. I think that looks a little bit better. So that's definitely looking better, but we're still not quite there. So let's pull up our target material again, and let's see what is different about this. So if we look at this, one thing that we can notice is that there's actually some more higher level detail in the color. So there's this sort of subtle color variation in the egg material where you can see it's transitioning between this more deeper orange color and this more yellow color. And it's those much more subtle levels of detail that you add onto the color that really adds again to the depth and realism of the material as we're building this up systematically. So what I'm going to do is actually down here, I'm going to start building in some color variation of the material. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a noise texture node, and I'm going to use this noise texture node to actually blend between two different colors. So I'm going to add a mixed color node, and we're going to make this blend between maybe a more yellowish color and a sort of deeper orange color. And then if we preview this texture node, which is going between black and white, basically if we plug that into the factor, what that's going to do now, if we preview this mix node, is going to blend between these two different colors based on the value of the noise texture. And then I'm actually going to plug the result of that into this mix node here. So now it is replacing the color of the eggs, and then we're going to preview this principled BSDF. So this is adding a little bit more realism, but one thing that I'd like to do is just add in a little bit more control into this. So one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a brightness contrast node here in between the noise texture and the mix node, and I'm going to use this as a way to basically boost the contrast, and that's something that we can actually expose in the material if we want. So I'm gonna change this to a slightly different color, and then this basically gives us a way to control the extent of the contrast between these two colors in this noise texture. Okay, so I'm just gonna rotate this around and get some different looks. So this is getting pretty close to what we were targeting, and actually a lot of the differences that we're seeing are mostly just coming from differences in the specific choices of the parameters. So if we vary some of these other things, we can get some maybe closer degrees of this to what we were targeting. So if we add this egg shape parameter, we can get a little bit more extremeness between the egg regions and those grooves, and we could also decrease the scale a little bit to make them a little bit larger. And then some of the other differences are just coming through in differences in like the very subtle color choices that we've made. So we're most of the way there, but we can see that we still have a lot of these options that we would probably like to have access to, and we'd like to expose those. So what we're going to do is expose all of those options, and then we're going to play around with that a little bit, and then I'm going to show you a couple of subtle issues that have been introduced when we start to scale some different things. So I'm going to hit tab to dive back into this, and then one thing that we're missing right now is access to most of this color information. So I'm going to add in a group input node here, and we're going to add both of these colors. We're going to add this color, which is the groove color. We're going to add this color over here at the end, which is the vein color. And then we're going to name all of those so that we know what they are. So we have this egg color 1, egg color 2, groove color, and vein color. Now we have access to all of those colors. Another issue that I'm noticing is that this vector isn't connected to the noise texture. So we want to make sure that all of our noise textures are connected to the vector input, so that when we change that, they all are changed together. And then another issue that I'm noticing right now is that not all of our scale inputs are actually being exposed. So real quick, what I'm going to do is, there's actually one minor change that I want to make, which is I also want to have a global scale for all of the textures. So I want to be able to scale them independently, but also scale them all together if I want. So what I'm going to do is over here in the egg shape region, I'm going to add a math multiply node. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to drag a value from the group input there. I'm going to call this global scale. And basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply all of my individual scales by that global scale. And I'm going to set it to actually a default value of 1. And then what I can do is just pipe that in so that now the egg scale is being multiplied by the global scale. And I messed that up a little bit. So let me set this to 3.5. I think the issue is the global scale right now is 0.5. So I'm going to set that to 1. And then now as I'm building in all of these additional scales, then I can just, again, add that math multiply node in between the global scale and the specific scale. So for the veins, I want the vein scale being multiplied by the global scale, and then I want that being plugged into the scale for the Musgrave texture. For this high frequency bump noise, we don't actually have a scale for that yet, so I'm going to add in a multiply node. I'm going to multiply the global scale by the scale that we want, which is going to be 50. And then I'm going to drag this into the group input, and that's going to allow me to set up another value, which is going to be the bump scale. And then it looks like that's all of the noise scale parameters. So an additional level of control that we would probably like to have is control over some of the parameters of the principled BSDF. So I'm going to add in another group input, and there are a few things that I'm going to expose here. So I want to expose the roughness. I want to expose the subsurface weight. I want to expose the subsurface scattering scale. I want the clear coat weight and clear coat roughness. And you can always add in more of these if you want. That's just the choice that I've made to expose these right now. And then I think one other thing that I want to do is actually add in another output from the group output. So this color node here is the last color mixture that's going into our base color. So I'm actually going to add this, drag this over to the group output and click that. And I think go to up here to the result. And I just want to change that to, I want to change the name of that to color. So I'm going to type in color. So I'm going to tab out of that right now. I actually want the BSDF to be connected to the surface. And now what we have is three different outputs, a BSDF, a displacement, and the color. And the reason that I've output this color is that this is potentially useful if we just want to use the color information from this node into another type of shader. All right, so we're most of the way there. We're just going to go through and do some final cleanup. So first what I would want to do is just check to see what we can actually change in this material and see if there's some additional things that we want to add in. So we can see that if we want to change the scale of the eggs, we can come here to the egg scale, drag that, and it changes the scale of the eggs independently of everything else. Just set that back up to 3.5. If we want to change the randomness of the eggs, we can make them really ordered or really disordered. We can change the shape of the eggs to make it really flat or pretty sharp. Okay, we have this value node here. Let's see what that is. Okay, so that was the edge groove width. So I'm actually gonna tab into this node group real quick and change the name of that value to the groove color width. Tab out. If we want to change the frequency of the pattern of the veins, we can change this vein scale parameter, so we can make it really high frequency or make it pretty low frequency. So I'll just set it to that for now. We can independently change the vein displacement by dragging this displacement. We have to be a little bit subtle with that. We can change the egg displacement independently of the veins. If we wanted to make the opacity of the veins just in terms of their color reduced, we could lower that, and then that gives it kind of like an organic look, like it sort of like has this see-through look to it. We can change the thickness of the veins pretty easily. And then we can also change I'm gonna reset that. We can also change the roughness of the material. So if we wanted this to look really rough, not so wet, we could set the roughness all the way up. It doesn't really look so much like an alien egg sac because it doesn't have that rough or that specular reflection to it. And then we can also do the similar thing with the coat weight. So you can see this coat weight is having a huge effect where if you just have the roughness down, I'm actually going to set this up a little bit. It definitely does have that sort of wet appearance, but I think the coat weight gives it that sort of additional layer of wetness that makes it look very organic. Another thing that we can do is we can change the length scale of the subsurface scattering. So as we increase this to larger values, then we can see we have a lot more bleeding of these colors, which gives it a pretty cool appearance. And then you can see how big of an effect that's having when we change the subsurface weight. And then another thing that we could do is change the scale of everything simultaneously using this global scale parameter. So if we increase that, then you can see that everything gets scaled at once. So the veins and the eggs get scaled all at once. So that really gives us a lot of different tunability. For example, we can change these egg colors. We could change it to have this sort of pinkish color, and maybe change the groove color to blue. And that can allow us to really vary the appearance of these eggs. So we have a lot of control over this material now. All right, but there is one thing that is missing here, which is that we really can't change the position of these textures on our object. And right now we just have a sphere, so maybe it doesn't matter that much. But if we had something like Suzanne or any other type of mesh, then we'd really want to be able to vary the position of these. So there's a couple of things that we can do here. One is, so I'm going to click this and hit Control T. Actually going to delete that image texture. And basically this is going to set it up to a mapping node. I actually want the texture coordinates to be the generated coordinates, which is what they were originally. And with this, okay, so one thing that we can do is we can change the location of those generated coordinates, but that really is just changing it globally, and it would be nice to be able to independently vary individual elements of these and also to add different types of animations. So I'm actually going to go inside this node group, and one thing about all of these noise textures that we've used, so let's start over here with the Voronoi texture. Right now you can see that it's set to 3D, but actually we can change this to 4D, and then what this does is exposes this new parameter W, which as we vary it basically is serving as sort of like a seed for the noise. And if we vary it very slowly, then you can see it sort of like continuously varies its position on the mesh. So what I'm going to do is, I'll just set that to 2, actually expose that parameter on the group input. So for example, I could call this the egg noise offset. And then we can just do that with each one of these materials. So for example, with the noise texture here that we're using for the color variation, we could change that to 4D, connect the W down here. This could be egg color variation offset. We can do the same with the veins, change this Musgrave texture to 4D, connect the W value down here, vein noise offset. And then we also have this bump texture that we can also change to 4D and connect that W parameter, and we can call that the bump noise offset. And then that's just going to give us one more level of control over this that is going to allow us to do things like we can change the position of the veins now if we don't like the way that it looks, if we don't like the way that the eggs are looking from the noise texture, that we can get different values of the W that can allow us to explore different looks. So that's really useful since we're using these noise coordinates. And that's one thing that I like about these procedural materials, is that you can really tune it based on your mesh without having to completely rebuild or repaint it. But I think that just one more thing that I wanted to show you related to customization is that on the subject of the subsurface, which I think is really important for giving things this very organic look, there is an important point, which is the actual type of subsurface scattering that we're using. So if I tab into this, right now we can see that if we go to here, we're using the subsurface random walk mode. So another option is, so the Christian Burley is going to be a faster method that is less accurate. I think now it's not even faster. So actually there's really no reason to use that rather than the random walk. But if you change from the random walk to the random walk skin, basically the difference here is that the radius that the light is able to scatter in varies based on the color for this random walk skin. And actually you can see this gives us a dramatically different effect, where now we're seeing actually a lot more color bleeding. And actually I'm going to dial down the subsurface scattering length, because for that subsurface scattering mode, it really doesn't work well for it to have such a large subsurface scattering length scale. But you can see that really gives it this almost more translucent look, and depending on what you're going for, that can be a really useful parameter for really controlling the aesthetics of these materials. All right, so that's everything with actually customizing this node group. There's just one last thing that I wanted to show you, which is in the very beginning of this video, I showed you this sort of morphing animation where the egg shader was shifting between these different variations of the material. So I'm just going to very quickly show you how you can set up that type of setup that allows you to actually mix between different variations, and that can allow you to generate even more types of materials. So what I'm going to do is just duplicate this node group by hitting Shift D, and then I'm just going to create two very different versions of this shader. So I think over here what I'm going to do is probably create something that is more similar to the version that we had originally, where we have this sort of orange and green look. And then I'm going to connect this other shader. So I'm going to connect the surface and the displacement, which is important. If you don't connect the displacement, then it's going to be completely flat. And what I'm going to do for this one is I'm going to dial down the egg scale. So I'm going to make the eggs larger, maybe not that much. Set it to maybe 1.5. And then let's increase the egg shape a little bit. We can decrease the groove color width. I'm gonna make the groove color sort of a black color. I'm gonna make the eggs more of like a deep red and purple color. And then let's make these veins also black. Right now, we can see that there's a lot of translucency to those. I'm gonna set the vein opacity up to 1. Okay, so now we have this very different shape. I think I'm going to actually change the subsurface scattering type on this one, because this is giving a really like see-through effect. So I'm going to change it to just the random walk. And that's going to give us a very different look. So now if we want to actually blend these two shaders together, there's two different things that we need to blend. One is the BSDF shader, so I'm going to add a mix shader node. I'm going to put this one in the bottom, this one in the top, and connect this to the shader. And the other thing that we need to blend together is the actual displacement. So I'm going to add a mix node here, and a displacement is a vector, not a float. So it has 3 components to it. So we need to add the mix vector node. And then I'm going to add this displacement here and this displacement to the top. And then we're going to connect the result to the displacement. And then now these have independent factors. So what I'm going to actually do is add a value node. And I'm going to plug the same value into the factor of each of these mix nodes so that they're controlled simultaneously. And then what you see is that now we have this shader where as we change the value, it allows us to mix between these two different types, these two different variations of the shader. And that can either allow us to get different looks, or you could even add additional levels of control where, for example, you could use a noise texture to drive this factor to get a spatially varying mix between these two different shader nodes. So there's a ton of different things that you can do, and by combining these shaders together you can get even more variations that can allow you to tune the look of the material. You can produce a bunch of different effects by blending and masking the materials, especially when you start to animate the masks that you create for the material. Alright, that's everything for this tutorial. Like I said in the intro, if you want the .blend file for this material, it's available for free on our Blender Market page. Just select the free version of our Principled Organic Materials pack. If you want more of these organic materials, we're also selling a pack of 7 procedural organic materials that includes this alien egg shader material. The link to that is in the description. Let us know if there are more tutorials along this vein you'd like to see, and consider following us on Twitter at BKSciBizTools for more updates on Blender tutorials, tips, and tools.